So as we go through and review our Protists Lab, just want to make sure that we start with keeping straight what exactly do we mean by protist, okay? So we know that these are not bacteria, they're not archaea, they are made up of eukaryotic cells, okay? Now if you recall, within the domain eukarya there are 4 kingdoms. There's the kingdom that includes animals, kingdom that includes plants, kingdom that includes fungi or fungi, and the 4th kingdom is protists. So remember, this would basically be if it's not a plant and it's not an animal and it's not a fungus, then it goes into the protist category, which means they are going to be very diverse, okay? But we know that they're all going to be eukaryotic types of cells. Now, some of them are unicellular, okay? Some of them are microscopic unicellular organisms. Some of them are going to be multicellular. Okay, there's a great variety in the types of organisms that are going to fall in this kingdom. Now, I want to talk about this in terms of 3 basic groupings of organisms within protists, okay? And the first group, so let's say if we have protists here, okay, we're going to sort of group them into 3 basic groups, okay? So this is going to be algae, okay, and I'm going to put here plant-like. They're not plants, right? Why am I saying they're plant-like? Well, because they have this ability to photosynthesize. So they're autotrophs, photoautotrophs that turn sunlight into food, make their own food. Now, algae can be single-celled, okay? Organisms, and algae can be large multicellular, okay, like seaweed. So let me just make sure I put this here so we don't forget. Now, the interesting thing about algae is that sometimes we don't realize that the majority of turning the carbon dioxide or taking it from the atmosphere is done by algae, okay, more than is done by plants. So algae are plant-like, they're photosynthetic. Now let's look at another organism, another group of organisms, okay, and these are protozoans, okay, and so they're not animals, but I'm going to say animal-like because they're heterotrophic, okay, they cannot make their own food, and also they're grouped based on their type of motility, how they move around, okay, so I'm going to put here movement, put heterotrophic. Now, these are typically single-celled, okay. Now I want to take just a minute before we get to our 3rd category and talk about within protozoans, we're basically going to look at 4 separate groups, okay. And the first are the flageolets, okay, so I'm going to put here and they're named flageolets because they move, right, by using flagella. So this guy should look familiar. Giardia, for some reason my pen is dragging there. Okay, as you see, it has 1, 2, 3, 4 flagella. Okay, so it would fall into that category of flageolets within protozoans. Okay, this guy up here should also look familiar to you because you looked at Euglena as part of your lab. Now I want to make sure you see, here's the flagellum right here, okay, for this particular organism. Now Euglena is really interesting because it has a flagellum, but it also has chloroplasts. So notice it's green because of the chloroplasts. So it's able to self-feed, right, or make its own food, and it really can switch. It also can be heterotrophic. So depending on the conditions, Euglena can really switch, right, between if there's plenty of abundant sunlight, making its food, and if not, in consuming food because of using being a heterotroph. Now, this here should look familiar. Paramecium, and I want you to look really close. It looks kind of fuzzy, right, around the cell membrane here. That's because there's little tiny hair-like projections all the way around the cell, right? Cilia. Okay, and so this paramecium is another category, a ciliate. So let me just put a box. So we have the flageolets, and we have the ciliates, and they're classified by their type of movement, right? Flagella for flagellates and cilia for ciliates. Now this next organism here should look familiar also. This is not a microscopic image. This is an illustration, right, of an amoeba. Okay, and that's the third group. And they move by something called pseudopods, okay? And so these projections, okay, is a pseudopod. Together, collectively, it's called Pseudopodia. And the interesting thing about those is they're not stationary, right? So this projection's here now. It can come back in, right? There could be a new projection here, okay? And by that, the organism can move. It can also surround and engulf food, right? Phagocytize the food. So that's the third group of protozoans. Now the fourth group, which technically doesn't have a mode of motility, the sporozoans, but they are spore formers, okay? So an example of this okay, this is one species. There are others. Plasmodium vivax, which is the cause of malaria. So we think about malaria being caused by mosquitoes, but really the mosquitoes are just the vector, okay, that's carrying this protozoan, okay, which is a protist, right? So I just want to make sure that I make this clear. All of these organisms are protists, right? Protist is the overall kingdom. These four categories that we've highlighted, flagellates, amoebas, sporozoans, and ciliates, these are all called protozoans, right? These are the animal-like. They're heterotrophic. We're classifying them by how they move. This particular group, okay, the protozoans, as a group, cause more disease. They have more organisms that cause disease than any other group. Okay, so amoebic dysentery you've probably heard of, caused by amoebas. Okay, African sleeping sickness caused by a protozoan. So there's lots of course, we mentioned malaria. There's lots of other diseases caused by these particular protists. Now I want to talk for just a second about the third group. Okay, and these are, that's an S there, the slime molds. So as you could probably guess, we're going to call this fungi-like, even though they're not in that kingdom because they don't share the same reproductive life cycle. They also, as we learn when we talk about fungi, their cell walls are made of chitin. That's not true for slime molds, but they have similarities in their appearance, right? Now, one thing that I want to make sure you understand about slime molds is they can exist really in two different life forms. So they can either be plasmodial, okay, or they can be in the cellular form. Okay, what in the world do I mean by that? Well, when they're in the plasmodial form, okay, it's essentially a very large single cell caused when multiple cells have merged together. And so there's going to be many, many nuclei. So it's a multinucleated, very large cell in this plasmodial life form of the slime mold. Now the cellular slime mold is what you would expect, right? Individual cells. Now I do have an image that I want us to look at. So this, you may have seen these in your yard. Typically, sometimes they are bright colored like this, but this here is a slime mold, and you can tell from looking at the appearance, right, that it has a fungus-like appearance. Now, I mentioned to you when we talked about the bacteria lab that the agar that you used to pour your petri dishes was actually from an algae. Okay, so when we go back here and we talk for a second about algae, okay, there are actually some beneficial commercial uses that we get from algae. So if you look at some food ingredients like in ice cream or other desserts, you might find an ingredient called agar, right, which is what we mentioned about in the plates. But you also might see another one. I see this one frequently. Carrageenan. So these are all, both of these, all right, are from algal organisms, and they're used in food. Also, air fresheners and shaving creams all have come from algae. Now, another type of algae that your lab didn't specifically mention that's very interesting, and we talked about it in lecture, are the diatoms. These are single-celled algae organisms that have cell walls made of silica or like glass. So if you have ever used diatomaceous earth for cleaning your pool filter or for gardening, that's essentially the leftover cell walls of these diatom organisms. So I hope that's helpful.